I think we are ready to go. Thank you very much, Nick. So, welcome everybody. My name's Simon Fraser. I'm the Deputy Chairman of Chatham House. It's my pleasure to be chairing this event tonight, a talk by Andrew Adonis on Can and Should Brexit Be Stopped? I hope you can hear at the back. Thank you all for coming. It's a full house, standing room only. That's great. A couple of procedural announcements before we get going. First of all, just to say this event is on the record, both the statement and the Q&A session. So that is all on the record. You can comment by Twitter using hashtag #CHEvents, which I think is on the panel there. Can I please ask you to make sure your phones are on silent so that you don't disrupt the events? Andrew is going to talk for about 20 minutes and then I will moderate a Q&A session. We'll come back to the arrangements for that later on. I think those are all the announcements that I need to make, so let's move forward. It's my great pleasure to introduce Andrew Adonis, Lord Adonis. He doesn't need a lot of introduction, I imagine, to this audience. Andrew was, of course, Minister for Education and also Secretary of State for Transport, and then more recently Chair of the National Infrastructure Commission, which role he performed until 2017, when he stood down, citing his opposition to the government's policy on Brexit. And since then, as I think we all know, he has been extremely active around the country campaigning against Brexit and in favour of a second vote, a people's vote, in constituencies around the country. Very high-profile champion of that cause. We've all been talking about Brexit endlessly for 2 years. We are now getting to the business end of this. The really hard times are coming in terms of the reality of Brexit. There's an awful lot to be sorted out. The politics is hugely polarised, and it's in that context that Andrew is running his campaign. We need open and honest debate on Brexit, and Andrew is one of those people who's certainly giving us that, so I think we all owe him a great debt of gratitude for that. Andrew, without further ado, I'll invite you to take the podium and address us on the subject, Can and Should Brexit Be Stopped?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simon. Can I thank you for hosting this? I'm told that the one place in the country where the Chatham House rules don't actually apply is Chatham House itself. Apparently everything is on the record. I'm speaking on the record, and just to warn you, I think the Q&A is on the record too. Now, this is England, and so we do banter. We don't do serious confrontation, which is just as well, because I spend many hours of my life in studios with Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg and Mr. Nigel Farage, and I have to survive somehow. And I have the banter down to a fine art, particularly now. With Jacob, my banter with Jacob goes roughly as follows, that when the President of France came 2 months ago to England, he very generously offered us the loan of the Bayer Tapestry. I'm not quite sure why he wanted to buy a tapestry, given what it celebrates, but nonetheless, we're very grateful for it, and it's going to go on display in the British Museum next year. And the President of France asked for a return gift, and Her Majesty the Queen has offered the President of France as a return gift Jacob Rees-Mogg. And he will go on display in the Louvre, as celebrating all that is best and worst about English history in recent centuries. However, because we meet almost weekly at the moment in studios. However, I have latest intelligence from the Elysee that the President has had to decline Jacob on the grounds that the Bayer Tapestry is considerably more recent. So, and I could do you, Nigel Farage. I will swap my seat in the House of Lords for his German passport, so it goes on and on. But the issues underlying the current situation are extremely serious. We're in a deep Brexit crisis, and we need now at this moment a plan both to get out of it and to get beyond it with confident national purpose and mission. And I want this evening to set out a plan with 3 points. First, the goal can and must be to stop Brexit entirely. Brexit is a cliff, it is not a gradient. The category mistake we're in danger of making is to believe that some Brexits are better than others, when the fundamental problem is Brexit itself. Being on the edge of a cliff, the necessary course for us as a country is to step back from the edge, not to delude ourselves with ever more absurd and bizarre schemes for jumping over the edge while clinging to a branch and hoping to find a ledge a third or halfway down. It is now crystal clear that the fatal flaw of Brexit is the act of putting the United Kingdom outside the European Union. Its markets, its customs union, its institutions, its law, its leadership, its future. Working out what we might do, having left, is the politics of least worst options, which is unworthy and dangerous for this nation and this people with its European geography and its European destiny. After 2 years now of ceaseless Brexiteering by government and parliament, it is a statement of fact that there is no viable Brexit plan on offer, none in sight, and that all of those mooted involve massive dislocation and ongoing uncertainty for our trade, our security, Ireland, and our whole international position as a country. Even if we could get something like a Norwegian or Swiss option, and don't get me going on the complexities even of those, and of course they aren't remotely government policy, but even if we could safely reach some Norwegian fjord or Swiss chalet, the difference between that and our present position in the EU is measured in miles and not in inches. And anything short of this is frankly ludicrous, as the last few weeks of keep calm and carry on Battle of Britain planning for food stockpiling and transport chaos has demonstrated. So that's point one. We can and we must stop Brexit. Point two, the path away from the cliff edge is for Theresa May to announce that the government's Brexit deal will be put to a referendum after it comes to Parliament at the end of the year, giving the British people the choice not to proceed and instead to stay in the European Union. If the Prime Minister will not do this, the House of Commons should direct her or her successor to hold this referendum, as it has directed monarchs and governments in moments of national crisis over centuries since Magna Carta. There's a lot being said at the moment about democracy and referendum results, which must be honoured irrespective of circumstances. But democracy is not a single event. It is a process of constant public engagement, what Clement Attlee called government by discussion. It's why we have regular elections for multiple tiers of government, why Parliament has 2 debating chambers and dozens of committee rooms and is not simply a registry office, and why the process of enacting even most minor legislation involves numerous stages over many months in both Houses of Parliament, not just one vote. So my second point is to state clearly that a people's vote to stop a government potentially harming the people not only accords with our constitution and traditions, but in my view is necessitated by them. Parliament has what Gladstone said in respect of self-government for Ireland when he proposed it in 1886, a golden moment to resolve an imminent national calamity. It's true, this moment does not feel particularly golden, but nor was it when Gladstone spoke amid continuing Irish terrorism and civil insurrection in parts of Ireland in the 1880s. His point was that Parliament had a rare moment of autonomy in its power to act, which is precisely where the United Kingdom is at the moment with Brexit. We have the autonomy to act now before the timetable actually to leave the EU on the 29th of March next year overwhelms us and we lose control of events, as we surely will. Which brings me to point 3. Brexit will only be stopped if members of Parliament show courage and leadership at this moment. If in the historic Brexit votes to come, MPs hand their consciences to party whips and leave it to others to do their duty, we will most likely end up with a blind Brexit, a Wile E. Coyote Brexit, where we leave Europe next March, running off the edge of the cliff without a credible plan for our national future, whatever the immediate provisions may be for stability. For this, we and our children will pay a steadily greater price in economic, diplomatic and possibly security vulnerability until, as we surely will in the next generation, either by our own initiative or through a European crisis, we once again take our place in the European Union. So this is the strategy, along with many other parliamentarians and others who I've been wrestling with this with over many months now. It has 3 key components. First, Brexit can and must be stopped democratically. Second, this can and should be done by means of a people's vote. And third, it's the duty of all MPs who realise that Brexit is basically wrong to support the people's vote and to give their frank advice to their constituents on the right course, which is to stay in the European Union. Let me address two crucial follow-on points. It's suggested by people in the shadows of our embattled Prime Minister that the choice in any referendum would be between her deal and something called no deal, something which I should stress does not exist and has not been defined by Jacob Rees-Mogg and others who glibly mouth the words no deal because it isn't remotely viable to exit the EU next March with no treaty governing the hundreds of issues from aviation to food safety vital to the life of this country. The fact is, it's Parliament which, if it calls a referendum, will also decide the question. And the only viable question, assuming that the Prime Minister succeeds in negotiating a draft treaty, is to put that draft to the people. I suggest it's sent to every household, as was done with the Good Friday Agreement in the 1998 referendum in Northern Ireland, and for the people to judge, on a case made factually and fairly by both sides, whether they think the Prime Minister's treaty is preferable to the benefits we currently gain from membership of the European Union. The second follow-on point is about timing. The same people in the number 10 shadows say we have run out of time to hold a referendum, but this too is incorrect. It's true that it may now be difficult to legislate for and to hold a referendum before next March, but Lord Kerr, very much of this parish, who drafted and negotiated Article 50, and other European leaders privately have made it clear that any request by the United Kingdom to extend the Article 50 timeframe for the bona fide purpose of holding a referendum, as opposed to an extension of further adventures in Wonderland, would almost certainly be granted. Because the European Union is, above all, an association of democracies. That, of course, is one of the reasons why it is so strong and so successful. It has always respected the democratic processes of member states, reaching decisions on treaties and policies, and no one seriously believes it's going to do otherwise on the most momentous decision by a member state since its creation 61 years ago. So I see the correct path ahead very clearly as a people's vote. I also believe that we would win such a vote if it was held. I think we'd win it by a large margin, not least because younger voters will very likely vote heavily against Brexit, and I would expect younger voters whose future is literally at stake to turn out to vote in record numbers. I suspect they might vote in numbers as large as the over 60s. That would be the first time that's happened in a recent election. But that, of course, presupposes that there is such a vote. And it's touch and go whether that will happen. Now, we are a great democracy, but it is impossible to warn too strongly that it is not foreordained that we will get through the next 6 months to next March without committing an act of massive national self-harm. Democracies, when badly led, and we have been very badly led, can and do make grievous mistakes, and sometimes people have to pay grievously in their livelihoods and even their lives. And yes, that does include England, this throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise set in a silver sea, the passage of Shakespeare's Richard II, which of course is a play about the destruction of a throne of kings. Part of the reason I'm so concerned that we might get it badly wrong is that we have, and this is, I know, a bit countercultural to our national story, but it needs to be said, that we have got it so badly wrong so often in the past. There have been 6 deep and prolonged crises of the British state in the last 150 years, since we became something approaching a democracy. We failed, as Britain democratised in the late 19th century, to put the government of Ireland on a liberal footing within the United Kingdom. We failed to halt the drift into the cataclysmic events of the First World War without any viable plan or policy. In the 1930s, we failed through appeasement to stop a second, even more bloody war with Germany in just 20 years. Then in the 1960s, the state failed to manage industrial relations effectively, which led to nearly 20 years of chronic industrial unrest involving the fall of 3 successive governments, Wilson's, Heath's and Callaghan's, and vast human misery across Britain up to and beyond the end of the miners' strike in 1985. That is 4 prolonged crises, and the 5th is now the rupturing of our membership of the European Union, which has been progressive since Margaret Thatcher's Bruges speech delivered almost 13 years ago to the day, in which she essentially declared war on the European Union, bringing us by highways and byways to the brink of Brexit today. My critical and very sombre reflection on all this is that in 3 of the 4 crises I have just mentioned, until the present one, government and parliament failed to take the right decisions in time to prevent the crisis spiralling out of control. Thus it was that in 1886 the House of Commons narrowly rejected Gladstone's Home Rule Bill because the Liberal Party split on the principle of a devolved Parliament for Ireland, with terrible consequences throughout the 20th century for Ireland and the entire British Isles. Thus it was that in 1914, the drift into cataclysmic European war went unchecked in Parliament, partly in a double tragedy because Prime Minister Asquith was preoccupied in the key month of July 1914 with a civil emergency in Ulster, created by the Conservative Party fighting Irish Home Rule, not only in Parliament, but through military mutiny in Ulster, and doing so in opposition to the 5th Irish Home Rule Bill in 30 years, or to be more precise, in 28 years, because the 30th anniversary of the Commons' rejection of the Home Rule Bill in 1886 was in 1916, the year of the Easter Rising in Dublin and the start of a full civil war in Ireland, right in the middle of the First World War. As for the crisis in industrial relations in the 1960s and beyond, in 1969, Harold Wilson's cabinet split fatefully on Barbara Castle's in place of strife plan for bringing industrial relations within a democratic legal framework. And the upshot for nearly 2 decades was year after year of widespread national strikes and bitter industrial strife and intimidation. Many of us here who grew up in the 1960s and 70s incredibly accepted as normal an intermittently functioning economy beleaguered by strikes, just as we got used to IRA bombs going off not only in Northern Ireland, but in Oxford Street and in Regent's Park. So let no one doubt Parliament's capacity to get big decisions very wrong with dire long-term consequences. Moreover, when fatefully wrong decisions are taken, the results are often worse, far worse, than even the pessimists predicted at the time, as they were in Ireland, on the Somme, under Hitler's tyranny, and in the successive miners' strikes of the 1970s and 1980s. I was travelling around Ireland by train 3 weeks ago. I go everywhere by train, and I could deliver a whole lecture much more passionate on Ireland's trains than on the politics and government of Ireland. But I watched on the television in an Irish pub as Leo Varadkar received the Pope in a very moving ceremony in Dublin Castle. Dublin Castle is where the court-martials and summary executions took place in 1916, after the Irish Republic was proclaimed in Dublin's General Post Office. I visited the post office when I got to Dublin. On the wall are these words of Seamus Heaney. History says, "Don't hope on this side of the grave, but then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme." That is the desperate situation into which our Parliament allowed Ireland to descend by decisions taken and not taken over a generation. Now, the observant amongst you may have noticed I said there were 6 prolonged crises of the British state in the past 150 years. I've so far discussed 4 and mentioned a 5th, appeasement in the 1930s, to which I'll return. What's the 6th? The 6th is a case of prolonged crisis where seriously wrong decisions were taken at the outset, but where, by good fortune and wise leadership, they were put right 2 years later, and the upshot was long-run benefits far greater than those predicted by optimists, such as the dynamics of getting big decisions right and wrong. I refer, of course, to the saga of British non-membership and then membership of what became the European Union in the 1950s, the 1960s and the 1970s. You know the story. Attlee and Bevin's decision not to join the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951 because the Durham miners won't wear it. The equally fateful decision not to sign the Treaty of Rome 6 years later. Macmillan's desperate bid to reverse this error in 1961, vetoed by de Gaulle. Wilson's repeat in 1967, also vetoed by de Gaulle. Success by Heath at the 3rd attempt in 1971, upheld in the 1975 referendum. The lessons crucial for our national debate, I suggest, are first, that out of the EU, it will be a nightmare to get back in. Last time it took us a decade of feverish diplomacy by Simon's predecessors, even with prime ministers and parliaments overwhelmingly committed to the cause. And that was negotiating with the European Union of 6. Think what it's going to be like in the fractured politics of post-Brexit, where even when and if there's a government intent on rejoining the EU, we have to negotiate with an EU of perhaps 30, with the memory of our traumatic departure etched in red. However, the bigger point to make, and let me make it because it's so rarely made, it was never made 2 years ago, and we've got to carry on making it now if we're going towards a people's vote, is that after the initial missteps, our membership of the EU has been an overwhelming success. Because of the long shadow of Margaret Thatcher and a culture of constant belittling of and lying about Brussels, we constantly lose sight of the fact that our 45 years membership of the EU and the 70 years of the European Union's rise and operation have been arguably the most successful decades, both in the history of this country and in the history of Europe. 70 years of peace in all of the states belonging to the EU, the only 70 years of peace in the history of Europe, 70 years of near universal growth and growing general prosperity across Europe, the only 70 years in the history of this continent when that's happened too. It's very telling to my mind that the 4 catastrophes I set out earlier all predate, or in the case of industrial strife started, before our joining of the European Union in 1973. Our international security, our trade and economic dynamism, our relations with Ireland and the position of Ireland itself, north and south, have been vastly improved by the success of the EU, a success to which Britain has so largely contributed, not least through forging of the single market by none other than Margaret Thatcher, before Jacques Delors came along as President of the European Commission and led her to fantasise that he was going to impose Marxism from Brussels. Now, you know the statistics. 45% of our trade is with the EU, 15% is with more than 70 countries with which the EU has free trade agreements, including most recently Japan and Canada. No one understood the potential of all this better than Margaret Thatcher herself. This is Margaret Thatcher in 1988, very shortly before her Bruges speech. How we meet the challenge of the single market will be a major factor, possibly the major factor, in our competitive position in Europe and world markets into the 21st century. Getting it right needs a partnership between government and business. That was Margaret Thatcher, 1988. Boris Johnson, 2018. Fuck business. I mean, that's where we've moved to as a country over the course of those 30 years. And to stress, all of the treaties and laws involved in membership of the European Union were freely enacted by our sovereign parliament as a free democratic member of a free democratic European Union, much of it under the single market programme. But far beyond the economic realm, I never cease to be amazed at the further instances of what Brexit might cost us. The low point of the 150 hours spent with Bob and others in the House of Lords debating the EU Withdrawal Act, almost as long as Liam Fox's circumnavigations of the globe in his quest for the easiest trade deal in history, was when it became apparent that leaving the European Union, wait for it, means losing the intricate legal basis for stopping cross-border child abductions, which are surprisingly common after marriage breakdowns and have been sharply reduced in number thanks to European law, and the automatic and immediate enforcement in all EU jurisdictions of one member state court's instructions on child return. When this came up in the Lords, no one has an answer to how it's going to be sorted out in any short period of time. A pro-Brexit peer said in so many words that more child abductions was a price worth paying for liberation from Brussels. I have never seen the House of Lords so angry. Whatever the instruction from the British people was on the 23rd of June 2016, it was not that, nor the hundreds of other things now happening, from the collapse of our space programme to the wholesale relocation of jobs, agencies and companies from Britain to the continent. There are 3 other immense dimensions to the success of Brexit, and conversely to the dangers we may soon be facing, which I just want to set out to get the arguments clear. The first is Britain's security and international influence, the mission of Chatham House. Because Brexit is economically damaging in whatever form, the line being peddled by many wavering Conservative MPs in persuading themselves to go along with whatever Mrs May proposes is that you can separate out economy and security and say, don't worry, we'll be safe with NATO. Now, crucially, NATO itself doesn't take this view. Jens Stoltenberg, the former Norwegian Prime Minister, who is Secretary General of NATO, constantly points out that if the UK leaves the EU, 80% of the military resources of NATO will be outside the EU, yet the EU's security and foreign policy institutions are vital instruments of the Atlantic Alliance. And of course, almost all the members of NATO vulnerable to attack from Russia are small European states. But if these international perils weren't clear enough 2 years ago, the 27 months since the 2016 referendum, Trump, Putin, Salisbury, Orban, Salvini, the far-right AfD becoming Germany's main opposition party, are flashing red lights. And for an exhibition just in the past week alone of the corruption of our foreign policy by Brexit and how economy and security can't be compartmentalised, look at last week's vote by the Conservative Party in the European Parliament to back Viktor Orban alongside Latvian fascists, the French National Front and the German AfD against every mainstream European party of left and right. Britain's Prime Minister is no longer prepared to criticise rising fascism in a European state because its leader's support may be needed for Brexit. Now, Churchill had something to say about this. Remember the faraway country of whom we know nothing in 1938? That was the one next door to Hungary. And this is not only shameful, it's also deeply damaging to Britain's true interests. Orban today, what price Salvini tomorrow? And who knows, Putin the day after. Next, Ireland. Now, as I say, I've spent a good deal of time in Ireland in recent months, and Ireland is a phenomenal European success story, north and south. The Ireland of today is socially and politically almost unrecognisable from De Valera, and Northern Ireland too is hugely transformed since the end of the Troubles. As I toured Belfast, Derry and the borderland, people kept pointing out to me where the checkpoints were, where the border posts were, where the army helicopters used to land because it was too dangerous for the army to move around by road, where people were killed by bombs and booby traps. Now, the border is detectable by only different colour road signs along the road. The barracks have largely gone, and in Derry city centre, the barracks have been converted into cafes and nightclubs. Now, Ireland is, to my mind, the Achilles heel of Brexit, because what the Irish North and South want to change is precisely nothing in terms of membership of the European Union. And that also is the British government's formal agreed position in respect of Northern Ireland because of the Good Friday Agreement, the fruit of stunning statesmanship by John Major and Tony Blair. Crucially, in the European negotiations leading to the UK and the EU's joint report last December, which began the process of formal negotiations, the Prime Minister accepted the necessity of a backstop in respect of Northern Ireland, whereby if new border or customs controls affect Great Britain after Brexit, Northern Ireland will remain subject to European law and customs and trade provisions to ensure full regulatory alignment. Now, Mrs May struggled hard to avoid a commitment to such alignment and to the backstop, but she had no choice for two reasons: the Good Friday Agreement and the reality that the Republic of Ireland would simply have vetoed any European Union negotiating position that did not guarantee that there would be no new border. Now, as I said, Mrs May struggled hard against these provisions, so much so that when she was in Belfast last month, she rhetorically disowned the backstop. But I very much doubt that Mrs May will in fact fail to honour the Irish backstop in any Brexit treaty, not least because of the very vocal concerns raised by the Police Service of Northern Ireland about what would happen without it. The Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland said last week that any different customs and tariff regimes between North and South in Ireland would be a smuggler's charter, and smugglers and paramilitaries, of course, have always gone hand in hand on the Irish border. But the call to ignore Ireland is disgracefully now par for the course amongst Brexiters. Nigel Farage, when I debated with him last week, told me that concerns about the Irish border were entirely got up by Barnier, and that anyway, Ireland was a tiddly country. Now, I don't want to elaborate on this, except simply to say that I do regard Ireland as the Achilles heel of Brexit, which is going gangrenous, and I suspect it may be the thing that finally makes Brexit impossible. And there is nothing more important to the domestic and foreign policy of this country than doing nothing whatever that jeopardises the position of Ireland. The third Brexit dimension is, of course, Great Britain itself. Now, the truth is that in the last 45 years, Britain would have been far worse off outside the EU. But in the last 10 years in particular, since the financial crash and living standards have stagnated or dropped, this has become layered upon a deep and growing sense of alienation, particularly in England outside London, where there is still no devolution worth the name, and there is deep frustration and anger. Now, from my extensive rail travels around Leave England in recent months, it's clear to me that if the question on the ballot paper 2 years ago had been, do you want a fundamental change in the government of England, or do you want an end to austerity, there would have been overwhelming yes votes to both of those propositions. But the only question on the ballot was, do you want to leave the European Union? An act which, if it happens, will in fact make it harder to do almost everything that people really want in terms of devolution and improved services, including the NHS. Now, Will Hutton and I discuss all this in our book, Saving Britain, available in all good bookshops for £8.99. Its central message is, change Britain, don't Brexit. But we also face head-on the issue of immigration, which was a major factor in the referendum, and we simply can't get away from that fact. We argue the case for ID cards, replacing national insurance cards, so that we know who is legally in the country, who is legally working and being paid legally, and who's eligible for access to public services. We also argue for a new migration impact fund, so that local communities are properly funded to meet the costs of new and larger migrant communities. And we also argue for our full participation in EU law, which, for example, in Belgium, requires migrants to register immediately on arrival and leave within 3 months if they don't have the means to support themselves. All these things are doable within the existing EU structure, and we should be putting in place the arrangements to do them if we face a people's vote. Now, in all these ways, we need to make the case for the EU with coherence and with passion, why it's so strongly in the interests of Britain, of Ireland, of our security, our prosperity, and our whole future. I want finally, though, to return to arguably the greatest of the crises I mentioned at the outset of this lecture, the trauma of appeasement in the late 1930s, when the effects of a seriously mistaken policy were to be experienced sometime after the key mistakes had been made. Now, May 1940 and the replacement of Chamberlain by Churchill is also the supreme instance of Parliament, in fact, getting it right in the nick of time. And in this, it's perhaps the shining example for MPs as they prepare for the Brexit votes to come. Now, on the events, hugely important events for the whole history of this country of May 1940, I cannot recommend too highly a recent book by Nicholas Shakespeare, 6 Minutes in May, an account of Chamberlain's fall through the prism of the critical vote at the end of the House of Commons debate on the fall of Norway in May 1940, the 6 minutes being the time allowed for MPs to file through the division lobby. It was in this crucial division that 39 government MPs voted with Labour, which, together with as many abstentions, made Chamberlain's position untenable and brought Churchill to power. Now, I draw 2 lessons from Nicholas Shakespeare's book, 6 Minutes in May, and reflecting on it. First, it is possible, by action in Parliament, to reconstitute a government in a time of crisis and fundamentally change its policy. But for the Norway debate and vote, Chamberlain would have survived, and there would almost certainly have been an armistice with Germany after the fall of France a month later. But the second lesson is that it was an unbelievably close-run thing. Clement Attlee, as leader of the opposition, didn't even decide to call a vote at the end of the Norway debate until the morning of the second day of the debate, because until then he thought that any vote would simply consolidate Chamberlain's position, since no Tory MP had rebelled in any previous parliamentary vote on appeasement or the conduct of the war. Even after the Munich agreements, when Churchill delivered what in retrospect was the most devastating indictment of appeasement, there were no Tory rebels, and even Churchill himself abstained, partly from the very real fear of deselection in his Epping constituency. What persuaded Attlee to vote against Chamberlain at the last minute was the brave action of a group of young Conservative MPs, many of whom had been fighting at the front, and one of whom went to see him on the night of the first day of the debate and told him that the war could not be won with Chamberlain and that a group of Tories were prepared to vote against the government. This persuaded Attlee, who thereafter led the opposition with his customary precision. Now, back to today, I hope that Jeremy Corbyn rises to the level of Clement Attlee and that Tory MPs will be in a similarly significant position and act accordingly in the votes leading up to Brexit. But I just want to make one final point. My political hero, Roy Jenkins, told me about the Norway debate firsthand, because his father, Arthur Jenkins, was Attlee's parliamentary private secretary at the time, and he, Roy, sat in the gallery for the debate. He said that Churchill's supreme qualities were confidence, optimism, and leadership. He used to quote the famous lines of another Irish poet, W.B. Yeats, on the problem of politics in the 1930s. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. The best lack all conviction, whilst the worst are full of passionate intensity. Yeats was so right, and so right today. We need the case for the European Union to be made with confidence, optimism, and leadership. We need the best, not the worst, to be full of passionate intensity, and it needs to happen now. Thank you very much.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you carry on applauding, we won't have any time for questions. Andrew, thank you so much. That was a very powerful statement. You argued that we need coherence and passion, and you gave us coherence and passion this evening. You set out very clearly your view that Brexit has to be stopped entirely. It's not about damage limitation. You made a very strong case for the need for courage and political leadership. You gave us examples where that leadership has not been shown in the past and the consequences of that. You highlighted the economic and non-economic consequences of Brexit in your view, and you ended with a rousing call for conviction. Thank you very much for that. I'm sure that there are going to be many questions in the audience. If I may, I'm going to start with one myself before I go to the floor, if you'll forgive me, audience. And that is this. You placed a very strong emphasis in your statement on the importance of Parliament and leadership in Parliament and parliamentarians taking their responsibility. But the people's vote is going to be the vote of the people. And you said also that you were convinced that if such a vote took place, there would be a very strong majority in favour of remaining in the European Union. I wonder if you could say two things. First of all, could you say a bit more about your evidence for making that assertion? And secondly, could you answer the point that concerns me, and I've heard from other commentators, that people may favour a second vote in principle, but they're very worried about how divisive and really potentially vicious a campaign could be, and therefore they're nervous about that.
Well, I'm very nervous too about the divisiveness. And let's be clear, I mean, this has been one of the most divisive things that's happened to us as a country. But the only thing worse than holding a people's vote, in my view, is not holding one, because the consequences of us crashing out, not least in the public and deep public bitterness there'll be when people appreciate the consequences over the immediate future, but certainly over 4, 5, 6 years, I think will be very great. And I think this could lead to really serious further instability in our politics. So though I don't in any way minimise the impact of a vote in terms of what's going to be a very, very difficult public debate, I just think the consequences of not doing it are greater. On the interplay between Parliament and the people, we are, never forget, we are a parliamentary democracy. The supreme political institution of this country is the House of Commons. What the House of Commons decide society is what happens. The reason we had the referendum is because the House of Commons voted for it. So the crucial first stage to getting the people's vote is for the House of Commons to vote for it. It cannot happen any other way. We do not have a constitution that has, as in Switzerland and some other countries, what's called a power of initiative, which is people themselves to require a referendum to be held. So the House of Commons has to vote for it. And as I say, I think that is going to be a very close-run thing, very close. And that public pressure is going to be hugely important to bringing that about. Why am I so confident that we can win the referendum itself, though? Because I'm absolutely confident from my travels up and down the country that the young are going to come out as never before in the electoral history of this country. They are, all the polls show, all my meetings show, they are overwhelmingly opposed to Brexit, and they have this classic combination, which is what's so powerful in politics, of altruism. I mean, they believe in the internationalist and the European ideal, but also massive self-interest. You know, as a student put it to me in a recent meeting I was at, I do not want to be shut up on a small island with Jacob Rees-Mogg, Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson. That is where the young are. They do not want borders. They want to be able to live, love and work across Europe. They rightly understand that Brexit can only damage their capacity to do that. They have careers to forge over the next 50, 60, 70, if they become members of the House of Lords, it adds to your life expectancy, 80 or 90 years. And they absolutely don't want this to happen. Now, I think that the turnout, I mean, the registration, because a lot of young people aren't registered because of complexities to do with the modern registration system, but we won't go there. I think registration will shoot up. I think turnout will shoot up. The young are organising amongst the young. Indeed, there are many of them here this evening. I have no doubt at all. I have complete confidence that we will win this people's vote if we get it. The problem is, to be blunt, is persuading marginal Conservative MPs who it's a hugely difficult thing for them to vote against the whip and cause difficulties for the Prime Minister to vote for the people's vote in that crucial division.
Thank you very much. Now, we have only just over a quarter of an hour, so I'm going to go straight to the audience, and if you don't mind, I'm going to take questions two at a time so that we can move forward. Can I remind you this is on the record? Also, of course, this is an issue on which people have very strong views. Could I please ask you for questions, not statements, and brief questions so that we can get as many in as possible. And when you ask the question, the microphones will come around. Could you please introduce yourself? So I will go around the room to try to get a range of questions. I'm going to start right at the back, and then I'm going to come here.
Hi, I hope I'm allowed to ask this. What do you think is Jacob's motivation for all of this? Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Goodness. Where do I start?
Sorry, we're going to take two.
Yeah, okay.
Roger.
Roger Little. How, Andrew, do you think we overcome the official Labour position that if the treaty is defeated, there should be a general election, which, of course, is guaranteed to make sure that Conservative MPs will vote for Theresa May?
Well, I could ask Jacob. I'm trying to get to debate with Jacob on no deal at the moment, because he and I have been corresponding, he with quill pen, me in by email, but we've been corresponding on what no deal is, because, as I said, no deal itself doesn't exist. So what does he actually mean by no deal? What is it that he's proposing? He has been reluctant to debate with me on it, but when he does debate with me, I will ask him what his motivation is. I will tell him I've been asked in Chatham House, and I would then report back to you, because I'm afraid I can't. That's beyond my pay grade to answer that at the moment. On Labour and the election, of course Jeremy Corbyn wants an election, because of course what he wants to do is to replace the present government. So what I'm assuming will happen in the key votes is that the first vote will be on a vote to dissolve Parliament or some equivalent of that. It's possible, of course, who knows what's going to happen, that could be carried. I think it's unlikely. But what we need to see is that if that fails, then that the next vote, which is, I think, the more credible one in terms of the parliamentary arithmetic, is on the people's vote. Now, as Roger knows better than anyone, there's a massive groundswell of opinion in the Labour Party, crucially including the trade unions, who really did move in a big way over last weekend, because they understand the importance of this for living standards and jobs, in favour of the people's vote. And I think that will weigh heavily with Jeremy Corbyn.
Okay, thanks. Can we just go one back there? And then a lady in the middle there.
Dominic, Karat. You mentioned about the need for confidence, optimism and leadership, and that the battle will be in the House of Commons. So would you be tempted personally to follow Lord Benn, or Anthony Benn, resign the lordship and fight in the Commons?
That's the first one. You've got time to reflect on that.
Hi, my name's Edith Greaves, and I am a young person, but I also worked on driving young turnout for the Remain campaign by encouraging voter registration amongst young people, which, as they move around, is very difficult. And one of the things that we got wrong was assuming that turnout amongst young people was automatically that they were going to vote Remain. And I think my question is, how do you convince people, because obviously, as you say, it wasn't about actual EU membership, it was about so many other things like immigration control and a changing economy and all this stuff that then got boiled up into this big mess that we're in. And how do we unpick that mess and have a clear message that says, look, the EU was a byword for a lot of anger and frustration about a lot of things, and how do we make that into a series of conversations about immigration, about the economy, and about young people?
Oh, well, those
Tony, Ben, and then...
Well, the very, very amusing thing is that the latest, the successor to when Tony died, the current Viscount Stansgate, is, I'm told, very keen to come to the House of Lords. So maybe we can do some kind of swap. But of course, this is all going to be sorted out in the next 2 months, and there aren't going to be by-elections and all that. So this is going to be the current group of parliamentarians who have to decide this, and it's very important that you engage with them in your constituencies, because they're going to be the crucial agents. On the making of the argument, the difficulty with the argument is, of course, that those making the argument won't have control of policy. We're not the government. I mean, we'll be in opposition. And I'm very wary about making promises that can't be delivered. So I certainly don't think we should make any promises contingent upon renegotiating of any European treaties, because I think that would be a real hostage to fortune. The big thing, we do need to show that we understand the wider context and debate. I think that's hugely important. And in particular, we need to get out of London a lot. I mean, most of the meetings and engagement I do is out of London, and frankly, that's hugely important. But the big missing link, I think, in the campaign 2 years ago, the huge missing link, was that we did not make the positive case for Europe itself. There is a massive positive argument to be made for Europe. We never made it. On the contrary, so unfortunately overwhelmed had the Conservative Party, including David Cameron himself, been by 30 years of the drip by drip of UKIP, Thatcher and all of that, that they were almost embarrassed to admit we were members of this organisation. And the other book I've done in the last few months is edited a collection of essays on prime ministers in Europe since Churchill, dedicated to the memory of Winston Churchill, who saved Europe and inspired the European Union. And so Ivan Rogers did the essay on David Cameron, which was a great revelation to me, because I hadn't realised that David Cameron, properly understood, was as close as it was possible to be to a Brexiter, whilst actually still favouring us just about remaining in the European Union. He spent his whole time, what happened with the referendum was not an aberrant act. He'd spent all of the previous 3 years trying to renegotiate everything in sight, trying to trade off the Stability Pact and the measures that was essential to take to stabilise the euro, with further opt-outs out of almost everything to do with UK financial services and all of that. So this was an accident waiting to happen. It was an accident waiting to happen in terms of what had been happening in the Conservative Party and UKIP all the way through. But it's also, I'm afraid, an accident waiting to happen in terms of David Cameron himself. Now, in the other book, Saving Britain, that I've done, the chapter on the politics of this, after having researched it and reflected on it, I entitled How Mr Farage Became Leader of the Conservative Party. Because to all intents and purposes, that is what had happened by 2014-15, particularly in 2014, when UKIP topped the poll in the European elections, and David Cameron was running really scared that there might be a massive UKIP surge in the 2015 election, which is why he doubled down on the referendum commitment and felt he had to deliver it immediately after the election. So we cannot go there again. We cannot, as a country, continue to be half in, half out, and depending on who's making the argument, more out than in. We have got to make an unashamed, positive, principled, passionate argument for a Europe which has done this country no end of good over the last 45 years, and we will bitterly regret if we take this decision to alienate ourselves from our leading international partners, our leading international markets, and our leading sources of international stability. We need to be making the argument in those terms, and as I say, it can't start soon enough.
Very good. One here in the middle, two in the middle, actually. If I just take these two, and then I'll just go to the back. There's a gentleman here.
Thank you, Peter Westmacott. Andrew, thank you for that. If in the meaningful vote, which the government reluctantly conceded, members of Parliament do what you suggest and decide that they will vote for the people to be consulted before we jump over the cliff, as you put it, what will be the question on the order paper? What will be the question on the referendum? Is it a binary question, or will there be 2 or 3 questions? How would you boil it all down to one simple question put to the people of this country?
Can we just pass the mic, the one behind? Thanks.
Yes, in a similar kind of vein, it sounded to me that the central argument you made is that we needed to get the MPs to vote to stop Brexit, effectively. Do you think there are enough people that have an interest in what you have to say that would use all the social media platforms available to them to address their MPs, their constituency MPs, to vote that way?
On Peter's question first, Parliament will, of course, decide the question. My own view, but it's only my view, and MPs will have to decide this, is that it's very hard to have anything other than a binary choice in a referendum. But I also think there are only 2 credible choices which face the country anyway. I think there is whatever Theresa May negotiates as against staying in. This theoretical option of no deal hasn't been defined, and my challenge to Jacob and Boris and co would be, before you can even consider whether anything could go on the ballot paper, which is a 3rd option, they have got to define it. I don't believe it can be defined, and I don't believe they would. And knowing Boris as I do, I think he would wriggle out of committing himself to anything anyway at the end. And if he's not prepared to do it, since he's the guy who's going to be going around with whatever he has on the side of the bus next time, then we certainly can't agree to it. So I think it will come down to a binary choice. In terms of influencing MPs, well, quite a few MPs are actually on Twitter now. I'm not sure how many do their own Twitter accounts, but some of them do. Quite a few of these Tories who are quite keen to be in the running for this and that job in the succession to Theresa May are on Twitter too. And well, actually, one of them who I've been engaging with intensively, because I take the view that I don't actually troll people on Twitter unless they're very important, on the grounds that I mean, it's probably quite useful for me to troll people. So I had a jolly good go at the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons, who's now dubbed me the ermine-clad troll, he's called me, which is a huge badge of honour. That's right up there, alongside Jacob saying I'm a caveman and other prize insults. But he said to me back, do you troll everyone? And I said, no, only chairs of influential House of Commons committees who actually should know better than supporting Brexit. So I think piling in on these people is very, very important. And after all, they're public figures. I mean, provided, it should be polite and all that, but they're absolutely open and should be to being tackled by social media. And it does have an impact. And frankly, the more of it, the better. And the more organised it is, the better. And the more young people who do it, because they'll see lots of potential voters and all of that who do it, the better too.
I saw you on Twitter saying that you wanted to be considered the most annoying person on Twitter yesterday.
Yeah, I'm only, apparently...
That's some tough competition.
Well, amongst the Leavers, I'm only the 5th most annoying.
Yeah, that's right.
So I've got to try and get further up there.
I've got some of the front, but I want to go to the back to be democratic, and I will come back to the front. The gentleman right at the back with the glasses.
Thank you. My name's John Krause. I've got 2 children nearing the end of education, and they're dismayed by Brexit and utterly appalled with the political leadership in this country to deal with it. So my question is, do you think that the European leadership, the European politicians, can help in any way? Can they provide an olive branch, and if so, what might it be?
Okay, and one at the front here, please.
Yeah, my name is John Preston. I'm a student of European history in Chatham House. My concern is in 2 ways. Germany and Japan pulled out of the League of Nations, and the consequences were very serious. The language of Brexiteers is in a similar direction. Where is that direction taking us?
Good question. 2 good questions.
Well, I don't think anyone else is going to go near Brexit. I think we have done a kind of controlled laboratory experiment on why it's a pretty bad idea. And as I say, I think what will happen if we do leave is that a political movement will begin very quickly, I think probably the day after we leave, to take us back in again. This idea that somehow leaving next March is going to resolve this issue, I mean, it can't change our geography, it can't change our economics, it can't change our security. All of these issues still continue. My view at the moment, it's an issue I've discussed with Roger, who's as passionate as I am on these issues, is if we go into a whatever it's called, an implementation period or whatever title it's given, which is basically the status quo, but without a seat around the table of the Council of Ministers, which is, of course, roughly the position of the Irish backstop as well. If we go into that position, the easiest thing to do when it becomes clear that we can't negotiate anything sensible afterwards is simply to go back in again. This actually has, Jacob and co have realised this, which is part of the reason why they're determined to create waste and destruction all around them. But it's not actually possible to do it because all of the changes that need to be made mean there have to be some implementation period. So actually the issue of re-entering is going to remain absolutely at the top of the agenda for quite some time to come. And my own view is it won't be finally resolved until we either go right back in again or until we do adopt a status which is very, very similar to a Norway or Switzerland, which means that we're in, but for political reasons we can't actually have a seat around the table, which I think would be a bad position, but it's hugely far removed from where we are at the moment. So I've forgotten
the question at the back was about whether an olive branch can come from the other side.
No, well, they're doing exactly the right thing. No European leader that I've seen, apart from Mr. Salvini, has said that they think Brexit is a good idea. And every European leader has said that they want us to stay, and they've gone out of their way to be accommodating. Frankly, that's all that we can ask. We certainly don't need other European leaders coming and trying to sell Europe to us. We have got to sort this out ourselves. This is a problem made in Britain. It needs to be sorted in Britain. And if we're not capable, frankly, of sorting out our own big political crises, we can't really expect our European friends to come in and help us. Indeed, I can't think what they could do. I mean, let's be clear. Everything it was possible to opt out of, we have opted out of in the last 30 years, apart from the actual central institutions of trade. My own view, it's a subject for another day, is that we opted out of far too much. It's part of the reason why we're in this position. Unfortunately, after Thatcher, as part of the impact of Thatcher, instead of a be at the heart of Europe strategy, which we had right up to and including Thatcher herself, we then developed an opt-out strategy, which I think was a fatal mistake. And I think the leader for whom I worked, Tony Blair, it wasn't his finest hour, the degree to which we kept out of things European. There's not much more they can do. We have to sort this out ourselves. We're perfectly capable of doing so. Whether we do or not, I don't think is going to depend upon what our European friends do.
Okay, and we're coming to the end. We're a bit short of time. I'm going to, if I may, take 3 more questions very quickly, if you'll indulge me, 5 minutes overrun, and then I think we'll have to draw it to a close. There's a gentleman there. No, there's a lady here, and there's one at the back in the corner. Yeah?
My name is Iraj Bagarzadeh. You've made a very compelling case for your position, and I think most people in this room would agree with it, as do I. But do you not feel that the Brexit case is capable of being made much more attractively than the Remainer case? And with phrases like regaining our sovereignty and making our own laws and keeping immigrants out and blah, 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 and all that sort of stuff. All of those sorts of words have resonance. And I wonder whether the Remain case is being made aggressively enough and with enough passion in order to, in effect, counter those points and have the remaining people adequately taken into account the expertise of advertising, the advertising industry and the public relations industry and so on and so forth, to get help from those people in order to make this case much more compelling.
Okay, let's hold on to that one. Are we making the case effectively?
Well, in a sense, this is a follow-on from that, because...
Would you mind introducing yourself?
Oh, sorry, Susan Schoenfeld-Harrington. With all the money that Aaron Banks put in, that supposedly, some say come from Russian sources, et cetera, do you think that's something that can be prevented from happening in any future people's vote?
Fine. And one in the corner. There was somebody right at the back.
Thanks. Anthony Dunn. I'm completely underlined to anybody. Okay, the people's vote, assuming that you can, that this does actually happen, that Parliament can have its arms twisted to have it happen. Dominic Cummings and Matthew Elliott, the two most malevolent and odious miscreants in the body politic in this country. No, I don't like them. My views, not Chatham House's.
Questions, not statements.
Yes, these two.
Yeah,
these two pranksters, okay, are going to come back for round two. What are we going to do on the Remain side to face them off and counter their arguments more successfully next time?
Okay, well, those are three rather linked questions around making the case, funding, being effective.
Can I link those last two questions? There's one very important point I want to make. The Electoral Commission didn't conduct itself with great glory in the last campaign. I mean, the fact that we're now debating 2 years later decisions it's taken in respect of funding and the legality and illegality of what happened and all that isn't a great exhibition. But one of the things I think got really seriously wrong last time was allowing 2 Leave campaigns. Now, there has to be, and the law is perfectly capable of doing this, Parliament just has to say it, there should be one official campaign on one side and one official campaign on the other side. And there are 2 reasons for this. Firstly, because it means that then when it comes to the fundraising, you can only fundraise for one campaign. But also what you then cannot have is you cannot have an official campaign which claims to be respectable and an unofficial campaign that does the breaking points and all of the stuff which is deliberately dark and all of that, but which is not and does not have any association with responsible politicians who are going to have to implement it. So there's some big and important lessons. There are clearly lessons about Russian influence and money and all that, and we need something much, much more effective than the Electoral Commission next time. But I'm very strongly of the opinion there should just be one campaign on each side. They should be properly regulated, and they should have responsible political leaders, the people who are actually going to have to take responsibility for implementing these decisions, who lead them on each side. And that is just a straightforward matter of law and regulation, and it needs to be done. Now, the question about making the case, of course, you're completely right. Let's be clear. The Leave campaign had the best tunes last time. But let's also be clear, a good part of the reason why they had the best tunes last time is because they were straightforward lies. You know, let's be clear. Let's call a spade a spade. The £350 million on the side of the bus was a lie. The breaking point was a lie. The 7 million Turks who were supposed to be invading this country the day after the referendum, that was a lie. It is a fact that the 350 million is now the 50 billion exit deal. It is a fact that Turkey is not joining the European Union anytime soon. It is a fact that we're not going to have cake and eat it on all these trade deals. And so it goes on. Now, I'm much more confident because in the long run, in my view, in decent democracies like ours, the best arguments win. I think next time we will have the best tunes with one proviso, that we do not duck this fundamental issue, because after all, this is a referendum about belonging to the European Union. We do not duck this fundamental issue of it being a good thing and a necessary thing for this country to be a member of the European Union. If we cannot answer unambiguously yes to that question, then we shouldn't be going to a people's vote at all. And that is one of the big messages I wanted to get across this afternoon is we cannot continually do this half in, half out, trimming our sails, testing all the messages so that they're not too pro-European because we think people are having difficulty out there with these messages. Either we can sell a straightforwardly, robustly pro-European message on the grounds that we do not want to make people poorer. Their economy, their security, their jobs, their livelihoods are much better off in the European Union. If we cannot make that argument, then we shouldn't be doing this. I believe that we can. The fact that so many of you are here this evening and that when I go up and down the country, I see now hugely, as the political people engaged in this game call it, a hugely energised base. That is a really encouraging sign. And I think if I can sort of coin one of those great lines, the only thing we need to fear is fear itself. We can win this. It's the right cause. It's the right arguments. It is the whole destiny of this country at stake. We've been here before. The debate we're having on Europe is essentially the debate that Chamberlain and Churchill had in 1938. Is Czechoslovakia a far-off land of which we know nothing, or is it part of our own security, economy, and prosperity? I have no difficulty answering to that question whatsoever. I'm happy to pray in aid, Churchill, all of those great generations of passionately pro-European Brits. We just need to go out there and win it.
Very good. Thank you very much. Well, I'm supposed to thank you before the applause, but I'll thank you after the applause. Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for coming. It's been a very interesting and impassioned meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Pleasure.